It's Tutorial Tuesday here at Fort Mountain Quilting. So I'm really excited we get to do some binding today. And believe it or not, binding is one of my favorite things to do on the quilt, the finishing part of it. And I think the reason why I like to do binding so much is that I just get to sit down and relax a little bit at night. And after I sew my binding on, I love to hand stitch it. So that's my thing at night, is to sit down, watch a little TV, curl up with my dogs, and have the quilt in my lap, and we sit there and bind. So I'm really excited to teach you a little bit about my knowledge on binding, and hopefully maybe it'll give you some insight of binding, which sometimes is not people's favorite thing to do. So hopefully maybe this will help you become one of your favorite things. I also want to share, and I'm not on my phone being rude, I wanted to share, there is this app by Robert Kaufman, and you can get this. I don't know, see if I can get it on my phone here where you can see it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it well. It's a Robert Kaufman app. I would highly recommend you downloading this. And when you click on it, it gives you all kinds of things that you can use that will help you finish your quilt. And in this case, we want to do the binding strips. And if you notice, it gives you regular calculations, and it also gives you the bias binding calculations. And also you can choose the width of fabric. We're going to leave it at 43 because that's pretty normal. And then you can change it to the strip, the length that you want to cut your strip. And I usually do 2.5 inch. And then you put in your quilt size. So let's say my quilt is a 50 by, let's just say 50. And then I'm going to ask it to calculate. And what this is going to do is going to say, okay, you need 210 inches of binding. You need 6 strips, and that's going to be approximately 1.5 yards. I mean, a half a yard, sorry, I was reading upside down. So binding is going to be about a half a yard, and you need 6 strips. So that's just a really handy tool to use. It also does borders, it does backing, and all that kind of stuff too. So Robert Kaufman app that you can get and download on your phone is awesome to use. All right, so I'm going to use my handy Quilters Select ruler. Love this ruler. So if y'all remember, it doesn't move on the fabric, so it doesn't slip and you mess up. So Quilter Select, we got them here in the store if you need them. And then the way I do mine, you know, just a simple 2.5 inch cut. I line my ruler up 1, 2.5 on my fabric, and I start cutting my strips. So this is what we call crosswise grain. So it's going from salvage end to fold. That's how I do most of my binding. I don't use the bias binding very often. And I will tell you there's going to be a part 2 to binding, and that will be, I'll show you how to cut bias binding on the next video. Alright, so I'm going to take these over to my sewing machine real quick, and I'm just going to show you how to attach your strips together. So what I'm going to do when I make my binding is I'm going to lay it down one strip that way, and I'm going to take another strip. And if you notice, I didn't cut my selvage end off yet. I'm going to lay them across each other like that. I don't need to really draw lines or anything. So what I'm going to do is turn it. And I would highly recommend just rewatching this if you get confused on how to do this. So I'm going to put my foot down, and I'm going to start sewing. If you notice, I started in the corner there, and I'm going to go to the corner here, and I'm going to keep it lined up on that line there, because that's going to help me keep that line straight. All right, so when you attach another one, all you need to do is take you're going to flip this over. So if you notice how I'm doing this, I'm just going to flip this over like this. So now this is right side up, and then I'm going to put another one right over top of it just like that, and I'm going to chain stitch these. So all I did was crisscrossed them. I have a little extra, and I'm going to chain stitch these. So I'm going to line make sure I have my little ends here on my mark, on my diagonal seam tape that we sell here in the store. All right, and then I'm going to cut it. Oops, I hit the wrong button. All right, so I cut it. I'm going to undo my stitches, and then all you really have to do here is you're going to cut 1/4 inch off. All right, and then when you iron it open, That's how you get your miter corners. All right. So that's how you get those mitered sections sewed together. So I'm just going to iron it in half. I know that I have seen people do it where they fold it in like this and then fold it in like this to do your binding, and then they do that. I don't recommend that because now you have 2 layers of fabric when you sew it on your quilt. So I just iron it in half and then be done with it. All right, there's several different ways you can bind your quilt. You can machine sew it on one side and then hand sew it on the other side. You can machine sew the whole binding, and when you do that, you would sew it to the back of your quilt first, and then you would flip it over and machine sew it to the front. I like to sew mine by hand, so I machine sew it on the front side and then I flip it over and I hand sew it on the back. So just for the sake of time, I went ahead and did 3 corners of this quilt. 3 sides, but I want to show you how to do a corner, and I highly recommend, if you got lost, go back and rewind it and watch this part of it again. So what I did is, after I have ironed my binding in half, I put the rough edge, the raw edge, to the edge of my quilt, and if you notice, I left a tail, and I left a good significant size tail on here, so it's not sewed down, and that's where I started, and then I started sewing all the way around my quilt. All right, now I'm on my last side, and I'm going to show you how to do a corner. So we're sewing all the way around, a 1/4 inch away from the edge of your quilt, and again, this diagonal seam tape really will help you do that, because you can keep it lined up down here if you happen to forget your 1/4 inch foot at home. But anyway, okay, we'll keep going. So I'm going to lower it down, and I'm going to line this up, and I'm just going to sew. If I had brought my right foot, I would have had my dual walking foot on this. But as you can see, the Berninas do a really good job of putting this through. I really don't even have to have a walking foot for this. All right, so I'm getting close to the edge of my quilt. All right, and now I need to do my miter corner. All right, so I'm going to sew till I'm about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And that's pretty close. I'm going to lift my foot up, and I'm going to turn my quilt. All right, on the diagonal, just like that. And I'm going to lower it back down, and I'm going to sew off the edge. Okay. And then I'm going to make my miter. All right, so the way I do that is I take it, and I'm going to go up at a 45-degree angle. So again, it's like this. I'm going to go up at a 45-degree angle, and then I'm going to bring it straight down. So the best thing to do is watch this over again so you can see it. So I have sewed off here, and then I sewed at an angle. I'm going to go up, and then I'm going to come back down. And then I'm going to start sewing right there, and that's going to make my nice pretty miter corner. All right, now I'm at the end of my quilt almost, so you want to leave a little bit of quilting left on this. You don't want to sew the binding all the way down, because I need to have room to combine these 2 ends here. So I'm going to sew a little bit further down, and I think that's good. All right, I'm going to cut it. All right, and I'm going to go back to over here so I can show you how I combine my ends. All right, so I'm at the end, and this is where a lot of people say, I just don't know how to combine my binding. I don't know how to do it. So the way that I have been taught to do this, and there's a lot of different ways, I like my binding to end with that miter corner, just like you did when you were sewing your binding strips together, that little miter that you did when you sewed them together. You sewed them down on an angle. So this is the way that my trick of doing that. All right, we know that our binding is 2.5 inches wide. So what I do is, if you notice, this is the beginning of the quilt. I'm going to cut just a little piece off, and I'm going to use this to help me mark what my 2.5 inches are. So I lay it down flat. This is my beginning part where I sew my binding on. I'm going to lay my 2.5 inch strip that I just cut off, and that's all that is a marker. You could use a 2.5 inch ruler there if you wanted to. You could use a binding tool ruler if you wanted to. And then the ending of my binding, I'm just going to lay down on the top of it just like that, and I'm going to make sure it's pulled nice and tight, and then I am going to cut right where that 2.5 inches is at. So if you see, that's my scrap, and I'm going to cut it right there. Okay. All right. So the magic is, all right, I don't need this anymore. That's just a piece of scrap that I'm going to use. The magic is combining these together. So the one that's on top, I'm going to open it up. By starting of my quilt, I'm going to open it up. See, my fingers work. My fingers are dry. Okay, I'm going to open it up. And then I'm going to lay them on top of each other. I'm going to lay that corner and that corner, and this is where pins would be very helpful. And you know, we got these really cool pin cups that we have here. So I'm just going to use one of my magic pins. All right, and then I'm going to do the same thing down here in this corner. All right, so this is the same way that you sewed your miter on when you combined your strips. So I'm going to sew from this corner to this corner, and that's going to make it work. We'll cut it, and then what I like to do is test it to make sure it fits. So I'm going to test it, and it looks like it's going to lay nice and flat. All right, so all we do again is trim this off just like we did when we were trimming our strips, when we were making the binding strips. You're going to trim that excess fabric off at 1/4 inch. Just like that. All right, and then I'm going to finish sewing. And guess what? My binding is complete, and it is sewed on. It's ready to be hand sewed. Nice and neat. When you're hand sewing, I recommend a binding needle. I like to use Lori Holt's, and I usually try to get a smaller size because I just like to use the smaller ones. So this is Lori Holt's binding needles, and it's got like, she color codes hers. But this one's a little bit smaller, and that way when you're hand stitching, sometimes it helps to be smaller. And then don't forget about our really handy dandy needle threader. So you put the needle in there, and you put the thread down, and you push the button, and 99% of the time it is threaded for you. Can't have really big needles. And then I'm going to tie it off. Have y'all ever seen this trick before? To tie it off, you take the end of the string and you wrap it around your needle about 3 or 4 times, going away from you, and then you grab where you wrapped and pull it down, and that will put a knot at the end of it. So when I'm binding, it's just, I sit down in the evenings, I flip my quilt over where I need to start, and then I just start binding. You can use the binding clips. Some people like to use the binding clips to pull your binding down, and then I just go to town. I go slightly behind where my last stitch was, and then I just keep doing this until I'm done. I will tell you, fair warn, be careful. Sometimes you go through on the other side. Just be careful that you don't punch your needle all the way through when you're doing this. You only need to grab the binding, but you can see how sweet that looks, how nice it looks. So again, I'm just going to do a few stitches. So when you get to the corner, and you bound all the way down here to the corner, so I'm just going to put a few stitches here just to show you. I'm here at my corner. Virginia, I'm sorry, I'll have to take this apart and fix it for you. I'm here at my corner, and then I get to almost to the end, and I'm going to fold it over and make a nice pretty miter corner, just like that. And what I like to do is I like to catch that fabric, and I do my corners too. Like I'll come up and I'll sew these down just so that they stay better. And then I tuck my needle back through here just so I can start back on the other side. There's all kinds of ways to bind. There's all kinds of ways to hand stitch. You know, sometimes it might not be. There's a lot of different ways to bind. You can use bias tape. You can use the binding tool on your sewing machine. Some people like to leave extra backing on their quilt and they flip it over and do it that way and bind on the front. So there's a lot of different ways to bind. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, you can always re-watch it again if you missed something. And I'll be glad if you want to come in. I've had a couple people come in and we've sat down and I've just showed them how to do the binding. They finished their quilt, but they wanted to know how to do the binding. So I can definitely do some one-on-one training with that as well. And I hope you enjoyed my tutorial Tuesday. We here at Fort Mountain Quilting, we believe in doing what makes our heart happy. So long for now, and I will see you later.